What happens when an entire nation builds its wealth on something that was never really there? In China, homeownership wasn't just a goal, it was a promise, a path to stability, pride, and prosperity. For decades, buying property in China meant one thing: you were safe. Prices only went up. Developers promised luxury cities rising from the dust. Families poured in their life savings, taking on loans that chained them to an unshakable belief real estate never loses. But what if that belief was the biggest illusion in modern history? Today, we're diving into the Chinese property crisis, story of ambition, greed, and collapse. How did the world's second-largest economy turn a housing dream into a financial time bomb? And, more importantly, is this just the beginning of something much darker? To understand the crash, we have to go back to the beginning of the 1990s, when China's cities were transforming from gray blocks of state housing into glittering skylines. For most of the 20th century, you couldn't own property in China. It all belonged to the state. People lived in government housing provided by their workplace. There were no mortgages, no private ownership, and no property speculation. That all changed in 1998, when China officially ended its welfare housing system. Private ownership became legal. The message was clear: if you want a better home, you have to buy it yourself. This kicked off a nationwide obsession. Homeownership quickly became tied to status and success. Parents pushed their children to buy. Young couples couldn't even get married unless they owned an apartment. Banks offered easy loans, and the government encouraged the shift. Why? Because real estate was a powerful engine for economic growth. Building homes meant jobs, taxes, and urban development. Selling homes meant household wealth. And so, China built. Between 2000 and 2020, China constructed more housing than the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. Cities like Shenzhen, once simple fishing villages, became megacities overnight. Skyscrapers, malls, highways. It was a construction frenzy fueled by optimism and debt. But hidden beneath the glittering skyline were cracks no one wanted to see. In the early 2000s, the formula seemed flawless. Local governments sold land to developers. Developers borrowed money to build apartments, and buyers rushed in, expecting prices to keep climbing. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of endless growth. Land sales became the lifeblood of local governments. In some cities, up to 40% of their total revenue came from selling land. But here's the catch: local governments didn't own that land. They leased it for 70 years from the state. To make money, they just kept selling and reselling it to developers, often at inflated prices. Meanwhile, developers like Evergrande and Country Garden became national heroes. Evergrande, founded by Su Jian, promised luxury apartments in every major city. At its peak, it was valued at over $300 billion, employing millions. People believed these companies were untouchable. After all, the government wouldn't let them fail. Right. But to keep the machine running, developers needed more land, more loans, more buyers. So they borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed. They started pre-selling apartments, collecting money from families years before a single brick was laid. People put their life savings into units that didn't even exist yet. Banks extended credit like it was candy. By 2015, real estate accounted for nearly 30% of China's GDP. It wasn't just an economy, it was a pyramid, and like all pyramids built on faith and leverage, it could only grow until it couldn't. By 2020, the signs were flashing red. Apartment prices had risen so high that entire generations could no longer afford homes. Vacant properties numbered in the tens of millions. Some cities had more empty homes than families. Economists started calling them ghost cities. Towering skylines, perfectly paved streets, glowing streetlights, but no people. And yet, developers kept building. In August 2020, the Chinese government finally stepped in. They introduced what became known as the Three Red Lines. It was a set of strict financial limits meant to stop reckless borrowing. Developers couldn't have a liability-to-asset ratio above 70%. Their net debt-to-equity ratio had to stay below 100%. And their cash reserves had to cover short-term debt. On paper, it sounded like a move toward stability. In reality, it was the pin that popped the bubble. The moment those rules hit, Companies like Evergrande, deeply dependent on new borrowing, were trapped. They couldn't get new loans. They couldn't refinance old ones. They couldn't finish their projects. Suddenly, millions of apartments were left half-built. Buyers began protesting outside government offices, chanting, "Give us our homes." Construction workers went unpaid. In 2021, Evergrande officially missed its first bond payment. A $300 billion empire was collapsing before the world's eyes. Investors panicked. One by one, developers across China began to default. Fantasia, Casa, Sunac. Country Garden, the dream of endless growth, was dead. But the real shock was still to come. When a single company collapses, it's a scandal. When an entire sector collapses, it's a crisis. The ripple effects of the property meltdown were staggering. Across China, unfinished apartment blocks stood like tombstones of a vanished dream. Families who had paid in advance were left with nothing but debt. In one viral video, a buyer stood outside his unbuilt apartment complex and shouted, "I gave you everything I had. Where is my home?" The pain wasn't just emotional, it was economic. Housing made up about 70% of household wealth in China. When prices fell, so did people's confidence. Construction activity plummeted. Steel, cement, and appliance industries all suffered. Local governments lost their land sale revenue, leading to massive budget shortfalls. Meanwhile, China's younger generation, already burdened by stagnant wages and job insecurity, saw their future turn to dust. Many refused to take on mortgages at all, coining a new phrase, "lie flat." It meant opting out of the endless race for property and status. But if people stop buying homes in an economy built on real estate, what happens next? The Chinese government tried to contain the crisis. They cut interest rates, eased mortgage rules, and encouraged banks to lend again. They even ordered local authorities to guarantee housing delivery to finish stalled projects. But it wasn't enough. Developers were too deep in debt. Buyers had lost faith. Evergrande's liquidation case in Hong Kong showed that even massive restructuring couldn't save it. Its assets were worth far less than its liabilities. Country Garden, once seen as the last healthy giant, began defaulting in 2023. Foreign investors fled. The government faced a dilemma: bail out the sector and risk creating a too-big-to-fail problem, or let it burn and risk social unrest. They chose a middle path: small-scale support and selective intervention. But this slow bleed just kept the crisis alive. Stretching into 2024 and beyond, home prices continued to drop, and millions of Chinese citizens began to realize a terrifying truth: that the greatest source of their wealth had become a trap. If this all sounds familiar, it should. History has seen this before. The Japanese property bubble of the 1980s. The U.S. housing crash of 2008. Different nations, same pattern. Cheap credit leads to a speculative frenzy, followed by government complacency, and then collapse. In Japan, land prices in Tokyo became so absurd that the Imperial Palace was supposedly worth more than all the real estate in California. In America, families bought homes they couldn't afford, backed by banks selling toxic mortgage securities. And in China, it was faith itself that became the currency: faith that prices would always rise. But here's what makes China's crisis unique. It's not just an economic issue, it's a social one. In the West, you can rent and still live a comfortable life. In China, ownership defines identity. Not owning a home can mean being seen as a failure. So when the property bubble burst, it didn't just erase money, it shattered dreams, marriages, and mental health. By 2025, more than half of China's top 50 developers had estimates suggested that over 65 million apartments, enough to house entire nations, stood empty. That's not just an economic figure. That's a haunting symbol of lost hope. What the Chinese property crisis reveals isn't just the fragility of real estate, it's the fragility of belief. Every bubble in history starts the same way. A new opportunity appears. People believe it will never end, and the system bends reality to keep the illusion alive. But when confidence breaks, reality rushes in like a storm. In China, that storm exposed deeper issues: a dangerous dependence on property for growth, a lack of alternative investment options for regular people, and a culture that equated bricks and mortar with safety. Even now, the Chinese government faces an impossible balance between stimulating growth and preventing another bubble. Let's step back for a moment. This isn't just about China, it's about all of us. Across the world, property prices are soaring again. In cities from Toronto to Sydney, London to Dubai, people are chasing the same dream. Buy now or be left behind forever. But ask yourself, when homes cost 20 times the average salary, when debt is the only way to belong, when empty towers replace communities, is it really a dream? Or are we building the exact same trap, just with different names? The Chinese story isn't just a tragedy. It's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a society confuses ownership with security and speculation with success. So, what can we take away from these ashes? First, wealth built on debt is wealth built on sand. No matter how powerful the economy, no structure survives when confidence is its only foundation. Second, government control can delay a collapse, but it can't erase reality. Markets can be managed for a time, but eventually, math always wins. And third, dreams without limits always end the same way. When belief replaces logic and hope ignores the numbers, that's when bubbles burst. As we speak, global markets are once again chasing easy money. Debt is rising and real estate prices are surging worldwide. The question isn't asterisk. If asterisk, another property crisis will happen. It's asterisk, where asterisk and asterisk, when asterisk, because every empire, every economy, and every investor eventually learns the same hard lesson. You can T-build eternity on borrowed time. If you found this story compelling, remember, history doesn't just repeat, it whispers, and those who listen see the next collapse before it comes. This has been Shadows of History, where the past isn't just remembered, it's decoded. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the next great bubble is already forming, and understanding yesterday may be the only way to survive tomorrow.